Alright, so here's the question. Is the shiny new 9800X3D actually worth upgrading over the trusty old 5700X3D? Let's break this down. Right now, you can snag a 5700X3D with a decent B550 motherboard and 64 gigs of DDR4 for around $300. Meanwhile, stepping up to the 98 means you're at least looking at a B650 board. Add 64 gigs of DDR5 to that, that's going to run you about $700. That's over double the price, but are you actually getting double the performance? Spoiler alert, no. But the real question is, how much more do you get? Today I'm putting these two CPUs head to head across 7 popular titles in 4K, 1440, and 1080 to find out how much more performance the top dog gaming CPU gets over the best value gaming CPU. At the start of each section, I'll briefly explain the testing scenarios and settings used because benchmarking numbers are only meaningful when the conditions are clear and consistent. Think of it like comparing sports cars. 2 lap times on different tracks don't tell you much, but when 2 cars run the same track, the results actually mean something. Similarly, FPS comparisons are only valuable when you know the racetrack, so to speak, or in this case, the settings and scenarios being tested. Now, let's dive into the benchmarks. First up is PUBG, where I tested performance using a live match replay to ensure consistent results. In 4K, the 9800X3D delivered a 50% higher average FPS, a 77% improvement in 1% lows, and a 43% boost in 0.1% lows compared to the 5700X3D. In 1440, the gap widened even more, with the 98 showing a 60% advantage in average FPS, nearly double the 1% lows, and a 40% improvement in 0.1% lows. In 1080, the differences were even more pronounced than 1440, 63% higher average FPS, 91% advantage in 1% lows, and a 52% increase in 0.1% lows. The 9800X3D clearly outperforms here, particularly in lower resolutions where CPU performance is more critical. Next up is Fortnite, where I tested performance in zero build live matches, consistently landing in the flooded frogs area for accurate comparisons. In 4K, the 9800X3D delivered a 42% higher average FPS, a 79% improvement in 1% lows, and a 71% boost in 0.1% lows. In 1440, the results were similar, with the 9800X3D delivering a 45% higher average FPS, 64% advantage in 1% lows, and a 73% improvement in 0.1% lows. In 1080, the trend continued, 42% higher average FPS, 67% improvement in 1% lows, and a 61% boost in 0.1% lows. The 9800X3D maintains a significant lead across all resolutions, with particularly strong gains in 1% and 0.1% lows for smoother gameplay. Okay, next we have the recently released Marvel Rivals, where I tested performance in the practice range using Iron Man, running the same path multiple times for consistency. In 4K, the 9800X3D delivered a 30% boost in average FPS, 34% improvement in 1% lows, and an impressive 83% gain in 0.1% lows. In 1440, similar results with a 31% increase in average FPS, 28% bump in 1% lows, and a 64% improvement in 0.1% lows. In 1080, the gains were even more pronounced, 35% higher average FPS, 36% improvement in 1% lows, and a staggering 93% boost in 0.1% lows. The 9800X3D not only delivered smoother gameplay, but also handled those critical low frame situations exceptionally well. Next, we have Cyberpunk 2077, tested using the in-game benchmark on low settings for consistency. In 4K, the 9800X3D showed modest gains with a 4% improvement in average FPS, 9% in 1% lows, and 27% in 0.1% lows. In 1440, the differences became more noticeable with a 19% boost in average FPS, 28% improvement in 1% lows, and 63% boost in 0.1% lows. In 1080, the 9800X3D really pulled ahead, offering a 35% increase in average FPS, 35% advantage in 1% lows, and 59% advantage in 0.1% lows. While the differences at 4K were minor, the 9800X3D shined here in lower resolutions, delivering significantly smoother performance. Okay, next up is Rockstar's Red Dead Redemption 2, tested using the in-game benchmark on medium settings. In 4K, the 9800X3D offered a 22% boost in average FPS, a modest 6% gain in 1% lows, but a significant 42% improvement in 0.1% lows. In 1440, the average FPS was nearly identical, with only a 1.5% improvement, but 1% lows were 14% better, and 0.1% lows saw a substantial 59% increase. In 1080, again, gains were moderate, 8% average FPS increase, 15% 1% low increase, and 31% increase in 0.1% lows. While the average FPS gains were less dramatic, the 9800 X3D consistently improved on 0.1% lows, meaning the gameplay is much smoother. Alright, now we're on to Delta Force. I tested in live matches on the Zero Dam map in Hazard Ops mode with consistent runs in the same area. In 4K, the 9800 X3D delivered a 32% boost in average FPS, an impressive 81% improvement in 1% lows, and 44% increase in 0.1% lows. In 1440, the gap widened significantly with an 88% gain in average FPS, 77% in 1% lows, and 42% in 0.1% lows. In 1080, the 9800 X3D really excelled, achieving a massive 100% boost in average FPS, 91% improvement in 1% lows, and a 62% jump in 0.1% lows. The game clearly highlights the 9800 X3D's strength, especially at lower resolutions, delivering incredibly high frame rates and much smoother lows for competitive play. The final game in this comparison is Mount & Blade 2 Bannerlord, tested using the in-game benchmark with the 1000 battle size setting on the low graphics preset. In 4K, the 9800 X3D showed a 31% improvement in average FPS, a 59% boost in 1% lows, and a 38% gain in 0.1% lows. In 1440, performance increased further with a 35% higher average FPS, a 67% jump in 1% lows, and an impressive 90% improvement in 0.1% lows. In 1080, gains were consistent with a 34% increase in average FPS, 63% jump in 1% lows, and 85% improvement in 0.1% lows. The 9800 X3D shines in this CPU-intensive title, delivering much smoother gameplay and significantly better low-end performance, especially at lower resolutions. So here are the totals of all games tested in this comparison. In 4K, there was about a 30% increase in average FPS across all titles. In 1440 and 1080, there was about a 40% increase in average FPS. Now here are the 1% low totals in all games tested here. Across all resolutions, there was about a 50% increase. And looking at the 0.1% lows, in 4K there was about a 40% increase. In 1440 and 1080 there was about a 60% increase, indicating a much smoother experience with the 9800 X3D. So I hope this comparison has helped you understand the difference between these two CPUs and whether upgrading to or considering the 9800 X3D for your next build is worth it. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, make sure to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments which CPU you think offers the best value. I'll see you in the next one.